This happened in 2011. At the time, I was working as a construction worker, and our crew was deep into renovating an old hospital that had been closed for quite some time. This place was built in the 1950s, and from what we were told, it closed its doors in the late 1990s due to funding problems and because the facilities were totally outdated. Our job was to convert this rundown site into a modern, high-end medical office. Initially, everything seemed normal, but as soon as we arrived, the atmosphere turned strange pretty quickly. The first time I entered the hospital, I had the impression that people had just run away. There were discarded beds in the rooms, medical equipment lying around, and even patient records still in their dusty folders on the desks. It was like stepping into a time capsule, only heavily decayed by neglect and the elements. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay was unmistakable. For the first few weeks, everything was relatively quiet. The team was busy tearing down walls, removing old fixtures, and preparing the place for renovation. But then, things began to shift a little. One night, I was asked to stay late to oversee the unloading of new equipment. It was after 7 p.m., and everyone else had gone home, leaving me alone in this huge area, gloomy building, with only a flashlight and a portable radio for company. The electricity was out due to the construction work, so I was relying on a small generator that managed to keep the work lights running. As I walked through the long, dark corridors of the old hospital, I began to hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own movement, but when I stopped, the steps continued for a few more seconds. I then quickly spun around and shone my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint hum of the generator. I tried to ignore it and continue with my work, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. After all, it's not uncommon to hear noises in inappropriate places in old buildings like this. A few minutes later, I went into one of the old patient rooms to check if the floors were safe, and suddenly, I heard a soft voice. At first, I thought it was a figment of my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice. I froze, paralyzed in the same spot. I wasn't sure if I should answer or if it would be better to run away from there, as the echo of that voice repeated in my mind, making me feel increasingly uncomfortable. Slowly, I approached and peeked my head around the doorframe. My heart was pounding. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the silence of the hospital. I decided that maybe I should stay in the reception room, but it was too late for regrets. I returned to my tasks but couldn't get that voice out of my head anymore. Something inside me told me that there was something else there, something I couldn't see but was definitely present. A few minutes passed and the tension increased. 3 times I heard that voice. The first time, it sounded distant, as if coming from one of the next rooms. The second time, it seemed to be right behind me. And the third time, almost like a whisper in my ear. The last time, I felt a shiver run down my spine and knew I had no choice. I had to find the source of that voice. So with my flashlight in hand and my heart in my throat, I started walking in the direction from which I felt I was being called. Each step became heavier, as if the air around me was thickening. As I moved forward, memories of stories about the hospital began to surface in my mind. I had heard rumors about patients who had died there, and many claimed their souls still lingered. Could this voice be an echo from the past? I recalled once hearing stories from people who claimed to have heard noises in this building and even seen people wandering around here, but I never really took them seriously. After all, abandoned places like this are a magnet for drug addicts and homeless people, so it could just as easily have been flesh and blood people and not ghosts. When I finally reached the door from which the whispering seemed to come, I took a deep breath and was about to open it when the flashlight suddenly flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped me, and in that moment, the voice became clearer. "Help me." That simple plea froze my blood. Without thinking, I ripped the door open, hoping that perhaps a woman was in distress. But when I opened the door, I found myself in an empty room with only an antique chair in the middle. No one was there. That's when I knew something far darker and more disturbing was lurking behind the walls of this old hospital. I needed answers, and now it wasn't just a job anymore, but something bigger that forced me to confront the unknown. While I tried to process what had happened, that voice whispered my name. In that moment, my heart felt like an escaped stallion in my chest. I looked around the room, shining my flashlight into every corner, as if that could help find someone or something. But of course, no one was there. The voice came again, this time much more intense and clear, as if it were right next to me. "Help me." It was enough for my survival instinct. I ran out of the room, as if escaping a fire, without paying attention to what I was leaving behind. I ran down the hallways, dodging the rooms we still had to renovate, and back to the main entrance. As I did, I felt those footsteps following me, almost at my heels, but I never looked back. When I finally reached the lobby, I was gasping for air and drenched in sweat, even though it was the middle of winter. I locked myself in the doorway, anxiously waiting until the delivery truck with the equipment arrived. I didn't tell the driver what had happened because I didn't want him to think I was crazy or had some kind of psychological problem. The next day, I decided to share my strange encounter with one of my colleagues, a guy named Emmis. When I told him what I had experienced, he just looked at me with a raised eyebrow and finally said, "You're not the first person to hear strange things here." More than one person has had similar experiences. I froze. Apparently, several of our colleagues had heard voices and seen mysterious shadows gliding through the building. Most unsettling was what he mentioned about the old morgue. Some even claimed to have seen figures in hospital gowns walking through the corridors at night. That definitely sent shivers down my spine. But the final straw came a few days later. I was working late again, but this time I wasn't alone. There was another guy from the team named Felix with me. We were both trying to finish a job in one of the patient rooms, and as we were putting away the tools and equipment, we suddenly heard an incredible rumble from the hallway. It was a muffled sound, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Felix and I looked at each other, curious and a little nervous, and pulled out our flashlights. We thought maybe some of the equipment had fallen. So we walked toward the source of the noise, and when we got there, we were stunned. An entire metal shelving unit had toppled over. The strange thing was that this shelf, which we had firmly screwed into the wall a few days ago, couldn't have fallen without a lot of force. It was impossible. We looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else there, and all the doors were locked from the inside. I couldn't shake off the encounter I had a few days ago, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make Felix nervous. On the contrary, I tried to ease the tension by saying that maybe we hadn't secured the shelf properly, and he nodded, but I knew he was still nervous. Felix and I quickly cleaned up the mess and left the place as fast as we could. That night, I adamantly refused to work alone in that sad hospital. I told my boss that if he needed someone to supervise, he should find me a partner. Luckily, he was able to find someone to join me for the remaining shifts. The job was finished a few weeks later, and almost every night something happened. Noises, things falling, footsteps, and I swear, I could even see a shadow wandering around. However, on one of the last nights I supervised the work, I was no longer alone. When the work was completed, I have to admit that I haven't set foot in that place since, nor do I plan to ever do so. Today, the hospital is operational and one of the most modern and well-equipped in the entire city. But still, I pray to God that I never find myself in the situation of having to be treated there, because I don't know what I would do. Hello, my name is Kale, and I live in Tennessee with my brother. We both have a great passion for car racing. Since childhood, we've been very active in motorsports, and last month we were invited to participate in a competition that took place on one of the city's most important racetracks. We were very excited about this competition, but things didn't go quite as we expected, or as I expected. My brother took second place, but I, on the other hand, suffered a terrible accident when I tried to overtake another driver on the penultimate curve. I was lucky to survive, thanks to the fact that I received immediate care. However, there is something that my family does not know until now, and I don't think I will ever share it with them. But I feel like I have to tell someone about it. So here I am with this story. In that accident, I severely injured my left arm, broke my leg, and almost my neck. Furthermore, I got severe bruises and cuts all over my body. Additionally, I hit my head very hard, which led to significant bleeding. My brother rushed me to the nearest hospital, which was located in a hilly area near the racetrack. We didn't have time to return to the city, so I was treated at a small hospital center called El Descanso. Don't ask me why, but that name has always seemed strange to me for a hospital. The fact is that my brother admitted me there and stayed in a nearby hotel to take care of me during my recovery. The small hospital was located on the side of a mountain, and my room had a very nice view, which was quite comforting after 2 days in critical condition. I finally stabilized, but had no idea what was going on around me because I was heavily sedated and very injured. All the time I just told you about, except for the beautiful view from my window, was told to me by my brother. Later, on the 3rd day of my hospital stay, I woke up in the middle of the night, lying on a bed with an oxygen mask, plastic tubes, and various devices attached to my body. It took me a few minutes to fully understand where I was, so I looked around to find my bearings, and that's when I saw a middle-aged woman sitting on the couch. When I looked up, I realized it was a nurse. She was reading a magazine and hadn't noticed that I had woken up. "Water. I need some water, please," I said in a weak, hoarse voice. The woman put the magazine down and walked towards me. The moment she leaned over me, I could see her face. The woman was probably in her late 40s and wore very noticeable makeup, which scared me a little. In my moment of confusion, she said in her high-pitched voice, "Welcome." Then she slowly lifted my head and helped me drink water from a glass. Before I could say anything else, I passed out again. The next morning when I woke up, I actually felt much better, especially when I looked around and saw my brother, George, smiling by my bed. "I thought I lost you this time," he said while taking my hand. I smiled back and said, "You won't get rid of me that easily." We both laughed and then started talking more. He more than I, because my throat was still a little dry. George told me that our parents were very worried at home, but that he had handled everything alone, and fortunately, everything had gone well, although I almost didn't make it this time. We were chatting and joking when a doctor and a nurse entered the room. The doctor said, "Mr. Richardson, you are a true fighter, and your brother is just like you. He cooperated fully with us, and I can basically say that he was the one who truly saved your life." In that moment, I felt very happy, but my eyes turned to the nurse in the corner, and I realized it wasn't the one from last night. My brother stood up and went to the doctor. He told me that I could be transferred to a hospital near my house in 4 or 5 days. I was lying in bed, thinking about everything that had happened, when the nurse from before came to change my saline solution. I said in a weak voice, "Can you please thank the nurse from last night? She helped me a lot." But I was so weak that I couldn't thank her. The nurse looked at me with a confused face and said, "Okay, although it's hard to identify nurses without knowing their names," she said, "if you could tell me her name, I would certainly pass on your thanks." In that moment, I realized that I hadn't asked her name last night, so I felt a little uncomfortable. The next day, when the nurse brought me lunch, she left the room without me being able to say anything. I slept for a while longer, and when I opened my eyes and noticed the blue sky through the window, I realized that I had slept all night. Then I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was 8 p.m. I thought about calling someone when I heard a familiar voice. At that moment, I looked towards the door of the room and saw the nurse from last night standing there, smiling at me. Her lips were painted in a very bright red, which made her look really scary. She said, "How are you feeling today, Cale?" I smiled a little nervously and replied, "Quite a bit better. Hey, sorry, I forgot to thank you last night for helping me with the water." She didn't let me finish my sentence and told me that I didn't have to thank her because it was her job. Then she slowly walked into my room, sat down on the couch, picked up a magazine, and started reading it, just like the night before. I just lay there without saying anything else. After a while, another nurse came into the room. The nurse started straightening my bed and placed a table on it. Then she looked at me and said, "It's dinner time now, Mr. Richardson." The second nurse continued working alone, while the night nurse sat quietly on the couch, reading her magazine. I assumed she was probably the head nurse, so I figured she was visiting patients to monitor that they were being well cared for. I thought that was very kind of her, and the truth is that up to this point, both the facility and the care in the hospital seemed excellent to me. I ate quietly and in silence, and during all that time, neither of the nurses spoke a word to the other. After a while, the younger nurse left the room, and the head nurse remained sitting on the couch, reading the magazine. That's when I asked her, "What's your name, ma'am?" This time, the nurse put the magazine aside and looked at me. She smiled at me, and I noticed she had a crooked tooth. She replied, "My name is Claire, but everyone calls me Nurse Beeford." Then she stood up and left the room. I found her behavior a little strange because she had come to my room last night and just sat there reading a magazine. But I didn't think anything more of it and went to sleep. I woke up a couple of hours later and saw her again sitting on the couch, staring at me. Every time our eyes met, she smiled in a very eerie way, which actually made me a little uneasy. One morning, the young nurse came in with my breakfast, as she did every day, and I told her how Nurse Beeford always visited me at night. But her reaction was somewhat strange. She spilled the juice on the tray, as if I had said something horrible to her. Then she looked at me with her unusually wide eyes, and I noticed some beads of sweat on her forehead. Then she said in a quiet voice, almost a whisper, "How do you know about Nurse Beeford?" Her question confused me a little, but I answered, "Well, because she visits me almost every night, and last night I asked her name." I added, "The truth is, I find it a little strange that she never comes during the day or only works at night watch." Instead of answering that question, the nurse asked me, "Do you mean you actually saw her in your room?" I then replied in an annoyed tone, "Of course, what kind of question is that? She was here when you came with dinner last night. Didn't you see her sitting on the couch?" This time the nurse went from an anxious face to a panicked one and said to me, "Listen to me very carefully. This is your last night in this hospital, so you have to do what I tell you, okay? If Nurse Beeford visits you tonight and asks you to go somewhere, don't go, for the love of God, okay? Promise me, right now." Now I was worried. "What is this about?" I asked her, confused. She then replied, frightened, "Nurse Beeford took her own life in this hospital last year. Some of us still see her wandering the halls at night. She used to come to young patients and ask them to come with her, and we found 3 deceased patients whose deaths were not natural at all. People say she was having an affair with a man younger than her, who was a patient in this hospital, and that he broke her heart. Since then, her tormented spirit has been trying to take revenge on all the young people who come here." My head was literally throbbing with pain when I heard that. I couldn't believe I had been talking to a dead person all this time. I didn't know what to do. I mean, I couldn't leave this hospital before morning, and I had already caused enough problems, so I decided to sleep through the night. But the nurse was kind enough to stay until midnight. But she had 2 other patients to attend to, so since it was a small hospital, she eventually left the room. She told me to lie down on my bed and keep my eyes closed. After a few minutes, I fell asleep, but around 3 a.m. I heard a squeaky voice calling my name. "Kale, open your eyes. I have a surprise for you." Hearing that voice sent chills down my spine, and my heart began to pound like a horse in my chest. I recognized that it was Nurse Beeford, but I didn't open my eyes. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps leaving the room, but I kept my eyes closed and remained vigilant for a while longer, until I finally opened my eyes. The room was dark, but the moonlight shining through the window gave a clear view. After looking in several directions, I determined that no one was in my room. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to the left side of my bed, assuming it was finally over. But as soon as my head turned to the left, I saw Nurse Beeford resting her head on my bed, looking at me with her evil, angry eyes. Her face now looked swollen, bruised and disfigured, and blood was dripping from her lips, mixing with her ugly red lipstick. But undoubtedly the most unsettling thing were her eyes, which were bloodshot and almost completely popped out of their sockets. The sight of her was absolutely terrifying and frightening. Then she said in a horrible voice, "You think you can ignore me like this, Kale? I was the one who took care of you, and now you treat me this way?" I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't articulate a single word, while every muscle in my body was stiff, and my heart felt like it was in my throat. But the most horrible thing was yet to come. She opened her mouth, and a cloud of black flies began to pour out of it. The sound of those flies made my ears ring. I felt like the flies were going to suffocate me, and that I wouldn't live to see the morning. So I screamed as loud as I could. I literally felt life slipping away from me in that scream. Apparently, my scream echoed down the hall, and I don't know how long afterward, the doctor on duty and the young nurse ran into my room, turned on the light, and then the eerie image of Nurse Befford faded. When they saw me, shocked and trembling, the doctor thought I was having a panic attack, but the nurse looked at me with her very large, unmoving eyes. Although she didn't say a word, nor did I, she clearly recognized what had put me in that state. The nurse stayed in my room until the next morning, when my brother finally arrived. I didn't say a word to him about what had happened. I just went home silently. But even now, when I close my eyes, I panic at the thought that when I open them again, I will see Nurse Befford sitting next to my bed. This happened to me a couple of years ago. My story goes more or less like this. I suffer from chronic pain due to a back injury, for which I've had 3 surgeries. Most of the time, I cope with it and live my life. But every few years, it really gets to be too much. I fall into these bad depressions and stop talking to my family and everyone else. I usually become a hermit when that happens. My family worries a lot that I will hurt myself, and I understand that because in a couple of depressive phases, I actually reached the point where I seriously tried to end my life. That hasn't happened again so far, but even I sometimes fear my own thoughts. When that happens, my relatives send me to the psychiatric emergency room, where they usually put me on a 72-hour hold. For those who don't know, that means a 3-day involuntary commitment. This hasn't really bothered me so far, as I have good insurance. The place they send me is basically like a hotel where you can't have shoelaces. The worst part is that they admit me, and I have to cross the room while all the other patients stare at me when I walk in. In my case, the stares are usually not very friendly. You see, I am a man a little over 6'2" tall and weigh about 280 pounds. I have tattoos covering both arms, and since I had been depressed for months, my beard and hair were out of control. So at the time, I looked like some kind of Hell's Angels biker. So I never had problems with people trying to mess with me. The truth is, my appearance doesn't fairly represent me because I'm a friendly guy. But if you don't know me, you wouldn't believe it. Since I've been through this a few times, I essentially know what'll happen. They take all my information, make sure I don't have shoelaces or anything with strings, and then show me to my room. The rule assigned to me was co-ed, but in reality, roommates can only be of the same gender. It was also a low security level, which means everyone here is supposedly non-violent. My only problem with this place is that they have people like me, meaning without a history of mental illness, who are just going through a difficult time, mixed with all kinds of levels of patience. Fortunately, in the last 2 visits here, I never had any problems with anyone and hope to get through my 3 days uneventfully and complete my treatment. I was taken to my room, and the nurse told me that my roommate's name was Tom. She also started saying something like, "Tom is a really nice guy," and blah blah blah, which naturally made me a little weary. But we were in a psychiatric facility. Everyone here has some issues. These rooms are basically like a cheap motel, just maybe a little bigger. There are 2 beds, a bathroom that annoyingly doesn't have a full door, a desk, and each patient has their own dresser. It was 3 p.m., and Tom was sleeping soundly, which isn't that strange, since everyone takes different medications that knock them out or cause weird sleeping habits. So I didn't think anything was odd. In fact, after spending hours in the emergency room and a couple more checking in, I was quite tired myself and decided to fall asleep, which I did almost immediately. I had no idea how long I had slept, but when I woke up, it was completely dark outside, and only the small floor light that I couldn't turn off was on. That was supposed to provide some illumination for the room, and the patients couldn't turn it off. Suddenly, I turned to the side and saw that Tom was now completely awake and sitting up on his bed. He said, "What's up, man?" I would have said hello earlier, but you were sleeping. I replied, confused. Didn't they say your name was Tom? I tried to be as friendly as possible, since it's easier to get along with everyone in places like this. He replied, "Yeah, I was a little tired earlier too. I was trying to sleep as much as possible so I wouldn't have to interact with any demons." That should have been a huge red flag to ask for another room, but Tom was much smaller than me, and they search you head to toe when you first come in, so I had no reason to fear him. Instead, I decided to strike up a conversation with him about these demons he spoke of, which I found out were all the nurses and doctors. After talking to him about it, I told him I was still very tired and needed more sleep, so he said, "Well, it's really nice to finally have human company as a roommate." I took that as a sign that he was fine with me, and that I didn't have to sleep with one eye open. The next morning, I woke up early for breakfast, as I hadn't eaten in 24 hours. After I sat down to eat, Tom came out and sat next to me. Then we started chatting, and apart from him calling nurses and doctors demons, he seemed pretty normal. I mean, we talked for a while about normal things until he suddenly stopped talking and started turning towards someone behind me. Then he said, "Ella, this is Jessica. She's an angel." I turned around and saw a very attractive girl who looked to be in her early 20s, maybe even 18 or 19. She walked past and greeted Tom and everyone else sitting in the dining room. She was one of those social butterflies who made an effort to be super nice to everyone. And when I looked back, I noticed he was staring at her too much, so I snapped my fingers in front of his face. "Hey man, don't scare her," I said. Tom looked very confused, as if I had told him the most absurd thing in the world, and became very quiet afterward. Honestly, I didn't think much of it, as I had my own things to worry about. The rest of the day was as usual in a place like this. You have to go to sessions, talk to the doctor, take your medication, but most of the time you are idle and bored. The TV only has 4 channels, so even if one of them were HBO, it was a bust. So I spent most of the time reading books in the living room. While I was reading a book, Jessica walked up to me, introduced herself, and started asking me all kinds of questions about my tattoos. She seemed like a really nice girl, and just like me, she was basically a normal person going through a tough time. In her case, she just had a lot of anxiety, which gave her panic attacks, mainly because she had just started college and really couldn't handle the pressure. We talked for a couple of hours, and I didn't think much about it afterward, but Tom kept walking past us repeatedly. A lot of people hung out here to pass the time, so I didn't really think much of it. But later, I learned that he was burning a hole in my head the whole time. After talking to Jessica for a while, I told her I was going to take a shower before dinner and that we would meet up again later. As I said, the bathrooms in this place only have half doors. Old Western saloon doors, so when I was done, I could see Tom's legs under the door. I said, "What's up? Do you need the restroom? I'll just be a minute, I just need to get dressed." He didn't say anything and just stood there. I started to feel a little scared when I heard him shrieking from the other side of the room, and his silence was just strange. So I said, "Buddy, you need to back up because I have to get out." But nothing prepared me for what came next. Tom started yelling, "You are staring at me. You are Satan. You are Lucifer." He kept saying that over and over again. I was going crazy in that moment. I thought if I opened the door and beat this guy's butt, I'd be the one who gets shot and put in the quiet room. But I didn't know what else to do. Even though I was screaming as loud as I could, it didn't seem like the nurses were nearby. The bedroom doors in this place are very thick, so I was pretty sure that because some of the patients screamed in the night, they didn't want them to wake up the other patients. After what seemed like an eternity to me, but was actually only about 2 or 3 minutes, Tom finally stopped and left the room. That was the moment I got out of the bathroom and got dressed, and immediately afterward, I looked for a nurse to tell her what had just happened. I have no idea what she told him, but they immediately moved me to another room. I didn't see him again all night, but I was terrified. No one had ever screamed at me or cornered me like that in my life, and I couldn't sleep all night. Since I didn't have any clocks, I had no idea what time it was when I suddenly heard his voice from the main room, where the nurse's station is. "Where is he? Why won't he go back to sleep?" It was Tom, and he was using the same tone he had when he screamed at me in the bathroom. I opened the door a little so I could hear the nurse talking to him. "You will see him during the day and can talk to him now. Go back to bed." But for some reason, he seemed desperate to see me. "But I have to see him tonight. It's an emergency," he told the nurse. That went on for another 2 minutes before security finally arrived. I heard a scuffle, but there was no way I was going over there to see what was going on. I could still hear him screaming, but I couldn't understand what he was saying, and he finally started fading away. I assumed he had been taken to the quiet room, which was on the opposite side of the area. Needless to say, even with him locked up, I stayed awake all night. Morning came, and my doctor was already there, which sounded very strange since I normally only saw him after dinner. He called me into the interview room to talk to me. He basically asked me about every interaction I had with Tom, and I explained everything to him. When I was finished, he told me that I no longer had to worry about Tom because he had been transferred to another hospital. I've lived here all my life, so I actually knew about the hospital they sent him to, and it's pretty rough. It's the kind of place where they lock you in a room all day. I felt kind of bad because I knew he thought I was trying to steal his angel or something, and he was just angry at me over a misunderstanding. But whatever it was also nice to know that I no longer had to punch this poor guy in the face for scaring me so much. I finished my stay and actually felt much better about everything. My pain was being managed better, and I was ready to stop being a hermit. Then my grandmother came and picked me up. She hugged me, helped me gather my belongings, and said, "I think we are ready to go." But the doctor was back again very early, and he gave me a look that made me a little worried. Honestly, I thought they were going to hold me for longer again. Once again, I was taken to the interview room, and here they told me what really happened that night, and they didn't want me to know until I had completed my treatment. It turned out that Tom kept coming out that night, asking the nurse when I would be coming back. The nurse kept telling him that he would see me in the morning and did not tell him I had switched rooms. Apparently, this went on for hours before he finally started screaming about it. That's when security came, took him to the secluded room, and gave him an injection to immobilize him. The nurse contacted Tom's doctor and told him about the situation. Tom's doctor suggested they move him to the medium security wing upstairs until I was gone. But when they went to get his things, they found a 7-inch piece of metal that he had broken off a table in the TV room. That room has cameras and also windows where you can see the nurse's station. So I guess he waited until they stopped watching and worked on it until he broke it. I am 99% sure that asking to change rooms was the only thing that kept me from being stabbed in my sleep that night. They thought the same thing I did, which is why they sent him to that other hospital. Since he never actually attacked me, he wasn't charged with a crime, and I have no idea how long he was held, but I would be a happy man if I never encounter him again. Hello, my name is Anna. I have been working as a nurse in a state hospital for more than 15 years. And to be honest, I think hospitals are probably the only place that so bluntly represents the reality of life and death. When a patient recovers, we medical helpers feel joy seeing them alive and ready to continue with their destiny on this plane. However, when a patient dies, we mourn along with their family. With time and experience, nurses have been trained to deal with the most difficult situations. But when this incident happened, I was a new nurse in our hospital and had only been working there for a few months. I was working in an emergency room where we experienced everything possible and impossible. A naive teenage girl who had cut her wrists, obsessed with her first breakup. A man involved in underground racing who had a car accident that left him paraplegic. A guy involved in street fights who suffered physical injuries that left him unrecognizable. When I say everything, I really mean everything. Such cases were routine for us, but this case will never leave my mind. There was a boy named Armando who was admitted after a suicide attempt. When his parents brought him to us, he was covered in blood and had horrendous injuries. According to a witness, Armando was sitting in the park with his friends when he suddenly stood up and ran toward a speeding delivery van. Undoubtedly, the van hit him very hard, and he suffered a very severe head injury, as well as multiple fractures and cuts all over his body. When he was admitted, his parents were crying and sobbing all the time. Their grief simply broke my heart. A team of 3 doctors and 3 nurses, including me, performed his surgery. But unfortunately, due to massive blood loss and shock, Armando went into a vegetative state. This is a state of complete unconsciousness, with some eye-opening and phases of wakefulness and sleep. The boy was about 14 years old, so everyone in the hospital felt extremely bad about this young man's sad fate and the pain his parents were going through. After the surgery, I was assigned to monitor him. His thin body lay on the bed all the time. His eyes were always open and constantly staring at the ceiling. The only time I felt like he was alive was when he closed his eyes to sleep after dinner. I remember that the way he looked at my movements scared me sometimes. One night, I was sitting next to him after giving him his dinner and was reading him a story. This is done to stimulate the cognitive side of his brain. His eyes remained closed the whole time, but I soon realized that he had fallen asleep, so I got up and turned off the lamp next to his head. I was about to leave, but I remembered that I had left my phone on the table near him, so I went back, turned on the table light to find it, and right at that moment, I saw that Armando's eyes were wide open, staring at me in the middle of the night. I have to say that being confronted with such strange and unusual eye contact definitely scared me. However, such mysterious events happened frequently. One of these puzzles that constantly occupied my mind was, why did this healthy, athletic, good-looking, and seemingly popular 14-year-old boy try to end his own life? Slowly, I began to notice changes in Armando's motor skills. The doctors were really happy to see such a rapid recovery in him and assured his parents that Armando might regain consciousness permanently in a few months. His parents were delighted with this news, and his mother came to visit him almost every day. One day, he changed his medication chart when 3 children of the same age as him came into his room with an average-sized adult man. He wore glasses and was formally dressed. Due to his appearance, I assumed he was a teacher from his school and that these boys were his friends. The boys talked to Armando and wished him a quick recovery. Then the teacher took his hand, and as soon as he did, I noticed a slight increase in Armando's pulse rate. Then this man said in a gentle and loving voice, "Oh, Armando, we miss you so much. Get well soon. We are waiting for you." My heart sank, seeing how his friends and teacher appreciated this young man. Within 10 minutes of their farewell, Armando's heart rate began to rise rapidly, and within 5 seconds, his body began to twitch in the bed like a rabid dog. He was having a seizure. I immediately called the doctors, and they gave him medication, and fortunately managed to control the situation. All night, I stayed by his side in the room, watching him closely and paying close attention to any change in his heart rate. After that day, we had to keep our eyes wide open and even stop visiting hours for a while, as another shock or seizure could trigger a heart attack. So we had to take pretty strict measures. After a week, we finally allowed visits again. On that day, his parents were taking care of the paperwork at the counter, while he was sitting in his wheelchair. So I went up to him and said, "You were a brave boy. Don't let anyone else hurt you again, okay?" But Armando looked at me with a twisted expression, and I said, "Hey, you're finally going home to your loved ones. You should smile, my dear." Shortly after, his father came and took him to the car. I was about to go to the office when I heard a phone notification and saw that his phone was on the table near him. So I picked it up and almost unintentionally read a strange message. "I already did what you told me to do. The day I blackmailed you about Mr. Blast to give me grades and nominate me for the scholarship. I knew it was you I was having an affair with. I was disgusted to fall in love with a guy like you, but we broke up. Now why are you blackmailing me with my private pictures you took too? I want them back now." Before I could think about what the hell this meant, I heard a sound behind me. "Excuse me, Nurse Anna. Armando forgot his phone. Could I please have it back?" Mrs. Palmer stretched out her hands to me, and my heart sank with fear. I handed her the phone. She took it and walked away. I walked to the door and noticed Armando in the back seat typing on his phone, which he had just received from his mother. The car engine started, and he looked at me one last time through the window, smiling from ear to ear in a mischievous way, winked at me, and made the sign for love and peace with his fingers in an almost mocking way. That was the last time I saw him. To this day, I am baffled by everything that happened and truly don't know what to think. I've been working as a staff member in a hospital morgue in my city for 6 years, but I still have terrible nightmares about it. I was 22 years old at the time and still quite new to the field, but I was nonetheless very aware of the mental toll this kind of work takes. Spending 12 hours in a morgue is by no means enjoyable. At first, I was almost always assigned to day shifts, but after working there for a year, my supervisor asked me if I would be willing to fill in for the night shift colleague during his vacation. I accepted the shift to make a good impression on my supervisors and received a new schedule. I was assigned to the night shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for 15 days. The first 3 days went as usual, but I have to say, it was really spooky at night. I often wandered around the morgue. Sometimes I visited the emergency room, which was directly above the morgue. One night I was sitting in my cubicle writing reports when suddenly a colleague called me to the emergency room. When I arrived there, I learned that a patient in cubicle number 3 had just died. The man had been in a really bad accident. I saw 2 or 3 doctors coming out of cubicle 3, their white coats soaked in blood. I was instructed to take the body to the morgue and the autopsy would take place the next morning. Up to that point, I had seen enough corpses, but when I entered the cubicle, my heart stopped. With wide open eyes, a racing heart, and trembling legs, I saw a completely mutilated corpse lying on the bed. There was blood everywhere. Flesh was protruding from the cuts on his legs and hands, but the worst part was the man's face. A shiver ran through me from head to toe. His head looked at me with an open mouth. The man was staring at me, his eyes cold and dead. For a moment, I had the feeling the man had blinked. At that moment, my colleague patted me on the back, and I flinched in shock. My colleague said, "Come on, Jake, what are you waiting for?" I didn't say anything and just started with my work. I hoisted the body onto a gurney and made my way to the morgue. Then I went into the elevator, and I swear it was the first time in my life I felt uncomfortable in an empty elevator with a corpse. After reaching the morgue, I unbuckled the lid again, and that gruesome face reappeared. I put the body in the display case as quickly as possible and returned to my cubicle. I sat down and began to write the reports. I don't know how long I was busy with my work, but a sudden noise broke my concentration. I heard footsteps outside, as if someone was walking down the hall. I stood up and left my cubicle. The room where the bodies are kept was at the end of the hall, and I saw that the doors were closed and the hall was completely empty. I walked toward the main room when I suddenly felt like someone was following me. I turned around, but no one was there, so I blamed my silly head for imagining it all. The main room was perfectly fine. Everything was in its place. Only the door to display case number 3 was wide open. That's the display case where I stored the man's body a few hours earlier. I approached the display case and felt the same shiver as before and took out the gurney. The man's body was still on it, but this time his mouth was closed. Not only that, a strange smile appeared on his face, and again, I felt like he was looking at me with his dead eyes and smiling at me. At that moment, I said to myself, "That's enough for today. I'm going home." I planned to call my supervisor and make up a story about feeling sick. I was near the exit of the main room when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw the corpse coming out of the display case like a creature from hell. His whole body was covered in blood. His eyes were now even wider open, as if they were about to pop out at any moment, and he was staring at me. I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed as I continued to experience this horror before my eyes. Suddenly, the man came out and stood on the floor. Blood dripped from his body, and the entire floor beneath his feet was red with blood. I said in a panicked voice, "You're supposed to be dead." But the man chuckled with a very deep, eerie voice and replied, "You know, the best thing about death is that you don't feel anything anymore." I couldn't believe I was talking to a living corpse. I let out a scream that echoed down the hall. I can't explain how he did it, but it was as if he burst through like the wind and stopped right in front of my face. His dead eyes were right in front of mine, and I swear I don't know how I didn't wet myself. I didn't know what to do at the time, but an idea came to me. I asked him, "What do you want? Please, let me help you." The man was staring at me now. I wanted to ask him who he was when suddenly the elevator door opened and I turned around. Then I saw my colleague from upstairs, who was walking toward the main room with some doctors. He said, "Jake, you're still here? There's hardly any work today. You could have left earlier." I looked back at the display case, and it looked like nothing had happened. There were no traces of blood or that man. I felt my legs begin to fail, and I started walking to my cubicle, but before I went in, I said to my colleague and the doctors, "I don't know why, but I feel like there was another reason for this man's death. He didn't just die from the accident." They all looked at me surprised, but before they could ask anything, I went in, grabbed my bag, and went home. The next morning, I got a call from a colleague. He said, "Oh my God, Jake, how did you figure that out? I know it was in the autopsy report, but how could you be so sure?" I didn't understand what he meant at first, so I asked, "What are you talking about?" My colleague replied, "The body recovered from the car accident had traces of arsenic found in his system. The doctors say he was poisoned before he got into the car, and now it's a crime case. The police are all over the hospital." I started sweating as if I was melting. That meant everything had really happened. It took me a while to come to terms with the fact that I had not only experienced a supernatural apparition, but had also talked to the ghost of a dead man. Since that day, I have never seen the ghost again, neither this one nor any other. I guess the fact that justice was being served finally let him rest in peace. That's how people say it happens in cases like this. The truth is that this event will forever remain in my memory as the scariest thing I have ever experienced. I am an internist and have been practicing for more than 15 years. If there's one thing I can say, it's that taking care of patients is not only a job, but also our responsibility. But not all patients are the same. When I was young and new to the profession, I worked in a small hospital in a rural area of my city. It only took a few days for me to become familiar with the staff and patients there. There were 4 other doctors there, and we all reported to the head of our department, Dr. Schneider. This woman was a hard person to make a good impression on, no doubt. And frankly, all of us doctors were scared of her. Not a single mistake could go unnoticed by this woman. Like any beginner, I wanted to prove myself, so I put a lot of effort into my work. I started taking many night shifts, as I lived alone and away from my family. I didn't mind spending most nights in the hospital. Most patients called me Dr. Morgan, and there were patients of various ages, but I especially remember a girl named Tanya, who was probably the youngest patient in the hospital at the time, and was already there when I arrived. Anyway, Tanya was a sweet child. She often wandered through the halls and talked to the other patients, but she was always alone. One evening, I was doing my usual rounds and walking down the long, empty corridor when I suddenly heard 2 people talking quietly. It was late, and all patients should have been asleep by then. I followed the sound coming from room number 201. When I opened the door and turned on the light in the room, I found Tanya standing next to the patient's bed. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened. Curiously, my sudden appearance didn't scare her. All she said was, "Hello, Dr. Morgan." I greeted her back and said, "Tanya, it's past your bedtime. What are you doing here?" She replied, "Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George." George was the patient in 201. He had recently had major surgery and was a little sensitive. Although Tanya seemed calm, I noticed in George's face that he was somewhat scared and extremely pale. I thought that Tanya's arrival might have startled him, so I said in a gentle voice, "Sweetheart, you can't be wandering around like this at night. Come on, let's get you back to your bed." Then I looked at George and said, "I'll send Nurse Martha for a quick checkup. She will give you a pill so you can sleep. You need to rest." I then accompanied Tanya to her room, where she went without a word. This little encounter didn't bother me at all until the next morning, when I went home around 4 a.m. after finishing my night shift. It was my day off, so I slept all day. The next day, I went back to work. That night, as I passed room 201 to see George, I saw a different patient sleeping in his bed. I saw a nurse walking down the hall and asked, "Excuse me, where's George?" She replied, "He is in this room." "Oh, you mean the patient in 201? I said, "Of course." She replied. I said, "Oh, he died yesterday, doctor. As you know, he already suffered from cardiovascular disease and seemed to be recovering well. Surprisingly, he had a heart attack yesterday." Dr. Owens signed his death certificate. "You can ask him. He will give you all the details." The nurse walked away, and I stood in the hall confused and somewhat surprised. Suddenly, something struck me as odd. I remembered when I asked Tanya what she was doing in George's room, and she said she had come to say goodbye to him. She just said goodbye. But why goodbye? She should have said good night, shouldn't she? I went to Tanya's room. She was sitting on her bed, drawing some pictures. Without wasting a second, I asked her, "Tanya, why did you go to George's room to say goodbye? You were supposed to wish him good night, right?" Her face changed color. She hesitated and said, I said good night. You heard wrong." Suddenly, she looked over my shoulder, as if someone was standing behind me and looking at her. I immediately turned around, but no one was there. The cleaning staff came a little later and began mopping the floor. Tanya started drawing again, and still curious, I returned to work but couldn't concentrate on my work. This unusual thought continued to bother me. Why did Tanya say goodbye to George? Did she know he was about to die? A week passed, and I almost forgot about it. But one night, I was doing my usual rounds and walking down the corridor on the second floor when I saw Tanya leaving room 706 and slowly walking down the stairs. Room 706 had recently admitted a female patient with a severe head injury. I went in and saw that the woman was awake. "Who is it now?" she asked. Then she looked at me and said, "Oh, it's you, doctor." I nodded and asked her, "How are you feeling?" She said, "I feel a little dizzy, doctor." I said, "Did someone come in before you?" She replied, "Yes, a girl came in. She said her name is Tanja." I immediately asked her, what was she doing here? Did she say anything to you? She replied, "Yes, she was a sweet girl, but I think she said it wrong. I think she meant to say good night, but instead she said goodbye to me. Strange, right?" My heartbeat sped up. I put the patient back to bed and returned to my room. Deep in my heart, I knew what was coming. The next morning, she passed away. I had a strong feeling that Tanja had an uncanny ability to know when a patient's time was up, but I couldn't tell anyone because no one would believe me. I couldn't do anything because she wasn't harming anyone. She was just a little girl saying goodbye to patients whose death was imminent. After 2 more incidents like this, I couldn't hold back. I went straight to the reception desk to Candy and asked her, "How long has Tanja been here?" She looked at me and asked, confused, "Who is Tanja? The girl from the ICU? Don't you see how she sneaks into the patient rooms?" I replied, "I don't know why, but I feel like something is very wrong with that girl." She said, "What do you mean, Dr. Morgan? We don't have any patients named Tanja right now. No child patients have been admitted to the hospital. Are you okay?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I've been talking to that kid for the past few days. Check the ICU records. Tanya, please come to my office." I turned around and saw Dr. Schneider standing behind me. I followed her to her office, while my head was still in a mess. After we entered, we sat down, and she sat in front of me. Then she asked in a low voice, Did you see Tanya? What does she look like, Morgan? Is she happy? I didn't answer her question, but asked, very confused. What is going on here? Please tell me what's wrong. Candy just said there is no one here with that name, and now you are asking me about this girl. What the hell is going on? Dr. Schneider couldn't hold back her tears. She started crying terribly, and I didn't understand anything. After crying for a while, she looked at me and said, "The week before you started here, I brought her to work. Her father was supposed to pick her up. I was working while she was wandering the halls alone and playing. Then she started using the stairs, and somehow her legs slipped, and she fell from the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor. We admitted her to this hospital because of her extremely critical condition, but she died." I couldn't believe what I had just heard. It felt like the floor was giving way beneath my feet, and my heart stopped. Tanya is dead? My God. I stood speechless and horrified in her office. Miss Schneider said that a nurse had also seen her walking around those halls at night, but she didn't believe her. Now, however, I was sure that she was still there. I worked at that hospital for almost 2 more years, but strangely, I never saw Tanya again. However, several of my patients reported during that time that they had been visited by her, and as you can imagine, none of them lived to tell the tale. I am a registered nurse in a small rural hospital in Minnesota and have been working there for about 4 years. One of the most difficult problems we face here is the high rate of substance abuse and mental disorders. I live in a town that is neither too big nor too small, surrounded by fields and small communities. Despite its size, we see many cases each year, mainly related to substance abuse, especially methamphetamine. This is where I practice my nursing, and before I forget, for the love of all that is good, I urge you, under no circumstances, to use meth. It will ruin your life in 1,000 ways. Advice from someone who deals with these patients daily. One thing that is often ignored is that drug addiction not only affects you physically, but can also lead to very serious and sometimes irreversible mental health problems. It's a vicious cycle that is often difficult to break. It is unclear whether the mental illness comes first or whether the drugs are the cause, but I particularly remember one night that illustrates this struggle. Our local emergency medical team received a call about a man suffering from drug-induced psychosis. They brought him to our psychiatric ward, accompanied by paramedics and local police. When I finally saw him, it was clear that this man was completely out of his mind. He was about 50 years old and looked completely unkempt. His condition was miserable. His gray hair was matted, he hadn't shaved in days, and his clothes were dirty and worn. He was almost like a character in a horror movie, speaking incoherently and making strange noises. His paranoid state was very obvious. He was extremely hostile and convinced that we were all there to harm him. We tried to calm the situation without having to restrain him, but I quickly realized that wouldn't work. I spoke with the doctor on duty, and we decided that the best option was to give him an injection of a strong antipsychotic, as his condition was truly critical. So I prepared the syringe and went back to the psychiatric area. When I entered there, a fairly large group of people was already there, including some of our security guards, as well as 3 or 4 police officers. The patient, although still restless, seemed somewhat calmer than the last time, but he still needed that injection to truly relax. I approached him with the syringe in my hand, but as soon as he noticed it, his paranoia returned. Although I had tried to speak to him in a calm, gentle tone, I could see in his eyes that he felt cornered. Nevertheless, I decided to try once more to calm him down. I moved a little closer and told him in a gentle tone that everything would be fine and that we just wanted to help. So I prepared everything to administer the injection into his right arm. I pulled up his shirt sleeve, wiped the injection site with a cotton ball, and spoke to one of the police officers about the situation. I told him I was about to administer the medication to keep him under control. Then I gave the classic countdown, 1, 2, 3, and stuck the needle quickly and firmly into his arm. A note on how I do this. I usually hold the syringe like a dart so that my hand doesn't shake when inserting the needle. In these moments, it is crucial to connect with the patient on a human level. But let me be honest, the technique is also crucial, especially in tense situations like this. As the medication began to take effect, the atmosphere in the room took an unexpected turn. We all hoped that with a little time and treatment, this man could regain some peace of mind. But fear and violence always lurk around the corner in these areas. I held my grip on the syringe like a cigarette so I could use my thumb to depress the plunger. But right at that moment, the patient panicked when he saw the needle and abruptly pulled away from me. The syringe was still in his arm when he moved, but suddenly he ripped it out and fixed his eyes on me. Before I could react, he lunged at me, swinging the syringe like a weapon. The officers reacted quickly, and one of them yelled about the needle to warn everyone in the room, but it was too late. The patient panicked, and although I tried to dodge him, I felt a sharp blow and a stinging pain in my left thigh. The syringe fell to the floor, but the needle was broken. At that moment, everyone jumped on the patient to control him while he screamed like crazy. I quickly grabbed the syringe from the floor, trying to process what had just happened, and noticed that the needle had remained stuck in my leg. While the officers continued to try to control the completely frantic patient, I told the doctor what had happened, almost in a panic, just thinking about the possible diseases that could have affected me. The doctor's eyes widened when I told him the needle was stuck in my leg. Before he could say anything, I immediately ran to the bathroom to check. Fortunately, the needle was not completely buried in my leg. About 0.5 millimeter was sticking out of my flesh, which was enough to remove the needle with a pair of tweezers. However, I was not safe yet. I now had to wait for a series of lab tests to rule out that I had contracted any diseases. After all the commotion, the man finally calmed down, and another nurse was able to administer the pain medication. When everything was calmer, a police officer asked me if I wanted to press charges against the patient. At first, I said no, because I felt sorry for him. Obviously, this man was out of his mind and unable to control his actions. However, as the shift went on, my perspective changed. Why should I let him off so easily just because he was high on amphetamines? Why should I carry the inconvenience of this experience for the rest of my career without this person taking any responsibility? In the end, I called the officer and decided to press charges. But 2 years later, it all led to nothing because it was said that the patient was not in his right mind. So I left it at that. Luckily, all my lab tests were fine. So apart from the injury to my leg and the big scare I got, the frightening incident left no other feelings except regret. I worked as a cleaner in a local hospital and was used to seeing people come in the worst conditions. But there is one patient who will stay with me forever. What happened to him is one of those stories you really can't forget. One night, I heard that his house had gone up in flames while he and his wife Elsa were sleeping in the middle of the night. They noticed the fire had taken over half the house. This man, whose name was Phil, managed to get out thanks to the help of his neighbors, but his wife was not so lucky. People whispered that she was so severely burned that her skin had literally melted. It was the kind of tragedy that made my hair stand on end just thinking about it. Phil came into the hospital with his left hand and legs severely injured, but fortunately, his condition was treatable, if you can call it that. I remember that of all the rooms in the hospital, this was the one that made me most uncomfortable. Every time I had to go in, a shiver ran down my spine. From the moment I crossed the threshold, the smell of burnt flesh was unbearable. And also, his room was always icy cold, as if life itself had been extinguished with a single breath. Phil was heavily sedated, struggling with pain most of the time. I couldn't even begin to describe the suffering of burn victims. It's something that leaves you speechless and makes you pray never to have to go through something like that. Once, I was assigned the night shift, which I actually preferred, as it was quieter. All the patients were asleep, and I could concentrate better on my work. It was about 8 p.m., and I went to mop the floor in Phil's room. When I walked in, I encountered a lone figure in the middle of the room, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was Phil, standing there and sobbing. The sight of his burnt hands and left leg was desolate. He was staring into a dark corner of the wall and whispering things that echoed with a ghostly tone. "Why are you doing this to me? What else do you want from me? Please leave me alone." I couldn't help but intervene and asked him, "Hey man, are you okay?" At that moment he turned to me, and the pain on his face was so palpable that I could almost feel it. Then he pointed to the dark corner and said in an almost broken voice, "Tell her to leave. She keeps coming back. Shouldn't she be dead?" I was very confused, and a shiver ran through my body. I asked, "What are you talking about?" "Elsa, my wife," he said with a terror in his voice that almost made me recoil. "She is always here, lurking." I stood petrified, listening to him, but before I could process what he was saying, he collapsed and fell to the floor like a sack of potatoes. In shock and fear, I spent a few seconds doing nothing until I had a reality check and realized I had to alert the doctors and nurses. When I finally did, they came running, all amazed at how this man had managed to get out of bed on his own, despite his very painful condition. From that night on, every time I had to clean his room, I was full of fear. I knew there was a logical medical explanation for what was happening. But believe me, when I was alone in that dark room, with only the labored breathing of Phil, I couldn't help but think that perhaps the ghost of his deceased wife was appearing in that dark corner, watching over him in his suffering. The truth is that it scared me deeply, and unconsciously, every visit to that room became a kind of excursion into the realm of the inexplicable, a place where grief and death converged in a way I couldn't explain or understand. I was just a cleaner, but whenever I crossed the threshold of the door to room 102, I found myself in the middle of a drama that I couldn't fully comprehend, but that you could feel in the atmosphere. Shortly after, a few days passed, and I noticed that Phil was getting worse. Not only was it visible in his burns, but his behavior was becoming increasingly strange. I could hear his screams echoing from his room, and every time that happened, doctors and nurses ran like firefighters to control the blaze. To tell the truth, that started to make me quite nervous. So I decided to change my shift so I wouldn't have to go to his room anymore. But it seemed that fate had other plans for me. One morning, my boss called me, and while I waited for him to scold me about something, he told me that I would be paid double for the night shift. Who could refuse such an offer, especially at a time when I desperately needed the money? So I agreed, hoping I could handle it, especially since I would have the next day off. I went home, took a short break, and prepared for the night shift. I had to be in my 5 senses, so I tried not to think too much about Phil. When I came back, my head was clear, and as usual, I started my rounds cleaning the rooms. After a while, I decided to take a short break in the cafeteria. While I was there trying to enjoy a drink, I heard footsteps in the hall. That's when I turned around, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There stood Phil at the end of the corridor, his limbs still marked by the deep burns he had suffered, and half of his face covered in hideous scars. "Is everything okay, Phil? You should be back in your room," I said, although my heart was racing. The sight of him was truly unsettling. He had a fixed, almost statuesque stare, breathing heavily, and seemed to be elsewhere. "Phil, you are scaring me, man. Why don't you lie down? You shouldn't be here." He was silent for a moment, but what he said next made my blood run cold. "She won't rest until she kills me." God, it's really hard to describe how terrifying those words sounded. "Phil, don't start again," I tried to reassure him, but the fear was deeply rooted in my system. "No, it's different. She is right behind me, and she is telling me to come with her," he replied with a hoarse voice that cracked. I turned around, but of course, no one was there. Just a heavy silence that sent chills down my spine. Phil's next action was something I will never forget. He pulled out a surgical knife that was on the table near him and started cutting his lips. Blood dripped quickly onto the white floor, as if he were painting a horror scene. But he didn't stop there. He continued to bite his lips, and the sound of tearing flesh filled me with nausea and horror at the same time. Suddenly, he let out a cry of pain that echoed through the room. "Are you happy now? Are you angry that I'm still alive and you're not? I'm ending this today. I'm ending everything." In that moment, I was completely breathless. Phil began to stab himself repeatedly in the chest with the instrument in his hand. It was the most horrible thing I had ever seen. Blood squirted out, and I was completely paralyzed with terror, as if panic had taken over my body. Immediately, several nurses and doctors rushed in, and then chaos erupted. Phil was rushed to the ICU in a flash, and amidst the great commotion that had several patients peeking through the doors, it was too late. He did not survive his injuries. I was unable to process what had just happened. Inside me, I felt that he had somehow actually seen the ghost of his wife. The doctors claimed that these were hallucinations caused by a head injury he had suffered in the fire. However, I believe that the ghost of his wife was really there. Sometimes, when someone dies and something haunts them, some people say they come back to haunt their loved ones, or in some cases, to take them too. Then I was left thinking about what the hell had happened to Phil. It scared me to think that perhaps Elsa, his wife, had not found peace and was now somehow clinging to him. It was a tragic story, and despite everything I had seen during my shifts at the hospital, this was an experience that marked me forever. At the end of the day, I went home without answers, only with a deep feeling of sadness and questions that would never be answered. Phil's experience would haunt me forever, in this world where grief and death often seem intertwined. Sometimes, ghosts are not just memories, but those who cling to life, trying to hold on to what they left behind. My father was in the last weeks of his treatment at a state hospital, so I decided to visit him on Father's Day. He had been in a psychiatric facility in the state of Georgia for several months after experiencing a severe depressive episode. This place has a long and somewhat sinister history, which makes it a bit fascinating. During my visit, my father and I started talking about strange experiences and some disturbing stories that had happened to him there, which honestly made me never look at that facility the same way again. The hospital opened its doors in 1902, and from then on, it became a sanctuary for people with mental problems and for those who had committed crimes and wanted to escape their consequences by feigning madness. Initially, it was intended to help those who needed it most, but it soon got completely out of control. Due to overcrowding, the number of patients continued to grow, forcing the hospital to expand its facilities several times. Of course, that didn't mean there were enough staff to take care of everyone. By 1935, things got even uglier, and the governor decided to fire the superintendent of the place, along with 80% of the staff. The replacements hired were chosen based more on their political connections than on their ability to work with patients. After this purge, more problems arose. The new staff had no idea how to treat people, and instead of improving the situation, the treatment of patients worsened considerably. The press brought to light the disaster that was taking place there. They reported the overcrowding and the mistreatment suffered by the inmates, as well as many cases of severe malnutrition because many were not receiving enough food. It was not until 1953 that a real change began to take shape in the institution. The government and those responsible for the hospital finally realized that something had to be done to improve the situation. New policies were introduced, trained staff were hired, and little by little, the well-being of the patients began to be ensured. Through these measures, conditions in the hospital improved, and the inmates received the attention they deserved. The facility became more selective in admitting patients who had to undergo a thorough psychological evaluation before being admitted. By the 1970s, the patient count had dropped from over 2,000 to about 600, and today, there are about 250. Fortunately, despite all the cracks the center went through over the decades, the place has become a point of reference for the quality of its service in the last 20 years. The reason I mention all this is that this dark past has generated many stories about apparitions and unexplained events that many patients and internal staff have experienced over the years. My father was one of those who had his own encounter with the unexplained during his stay at this facility. My father liked to be busy, so he was always willing to take on different tasks, whether helping with patient activities or assisting staff in various programs. He was always on the go and never liked to be idle. I understand that the hospital was more like a rehabilitation center, and compared to other places, the inmates there had a little more freedom. They could go wherever they wanted and participate in the activities they wished. However, there was one part of the hospital that was somewhat like a jail. On one such occasion, he was helping a woman who worked in that area with the laundry. Together, they were folding a pile of sheets and towels when, for a moment, they disappeared to get baskets to put the laundry in. When they came back, they found everything scattered and messed up. The strange thing was that this area was always locked, so no one could have come in and made such a mess. The employee there, whose name was Karis, told my father that a ghost haunted the place and that his name was Charles. She explained to him that they had different names for the ghosts that allegedly inhabited that part of the jail because there were so many that they even had to close some rooms because the ghosts there were so violent that they even caused physical harm to the workers who entered those places. That's why new residents or interns refused to stay there if they wanted to move, because strange and frightening things happened. Even the office of the former director is said to be so haunted that he told the staff that if they didn't get him a new place for his things, he would leave, and that he had seriously warned them. My father also mentioned that crazy things happened there, like objects moving by themselves, and even things flying through the air. The atmosphere scared everyone. Since he could often leave the hospital and had a job outside, some guys and he decided to take on some local work to maintain the lawn around the hospital and the nearby cemetery. One afternoon, they had agreed that my father and a small group of guys would work on a part of the grounds that was no longer in use. They were near an old building that was part of the complex but had been locked since the 1980s. The building was full of broken windows that showed everything inside, and as they were going about their work and chatting casually, he and another guy suddenly saw someone walking around inside. My father and his partner told their boss that they thought someone else was there. They found it strange to see a man in a place that had been vacant for years, but the boss laughed and said it was probably just a ghost and they were imagining things. Although my father is a reasonable guy, he and the others saw the figure clearly enough to notice his clothes. "Did you see what he was wearing?" the other guy asked him, somewhat scared. "Yes," my father replied. "Someone is playing with us. It's a person." Then he appeared again and walked quickly down the hall towards them. Through the window, they saw the stranger getting closer and decided to hide in a corner near the garage. The man was wearing an old black and white suit with a matching hat and had his head down as if he wanted to hide his face. The boy who was with my father ran out and said he couldn't work there anymore because he was scared. But my father yelled at him to run forward and catch the person who was trying to scare them. The boy hesitated for a moment, but my father told him to do it, and together they ran to catch the man. At one point, he just seemed to disappear. They stopped exactly where the man with the hat should have been, but he was gone. The building was empty. They checked all the doors, and surprisingly, no one was there. Somehow, their boss managed to get the keys to inspect that part of the old building, and my father said there was so much dust that they could see footprints on the floor, but they found no trace of the man they had seen. This guy must be planning something strange, my father thought, because he does nothing but hide from us and hide his face. However, several months passed and nothing happened until one day he volunteered to do some maintenance work in the office of the center's director. Upon entering, he saw a huge poster with photos of all the men who had directed the center since its founding in the early 1900s. Of all the figures there, one was particularly striking. It was the man who directed the center between 1922 and 1935, a guy named Arthur Bennett, who looked exactly like the man he had seen in the abandoned building, and was dressed the same way as in the picture. At that moment, my father was shocked. It was him. Later, he learned from the secretary that this man had died of a fatal heart attack in that abandoned building in 1935. At the time, That was the administrative building of the complex, and the director's office was there. It was not until 2 decades later that the administrative offices were moved to the building where they are today. I never thought I would find myself in a situation like this, but here I am, telling this hair-raising experience. Let's start from the beginning. It was a random Friday, and I was with a couple of friends at the nearby coffee shop, enjoying a hot cocoa and a delicious croissant. In the middle of the conversation, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my lower abdomen. At first, I thought it was just a temporary indigestion, but that fleeting pain turned into something much more intense. Not even 5 minutes passed, and I was already hunched over the table, trying not to cause a fuss. But the pain raged against me, as if trying to knock me down in 1,000 ways. My friends looked at me worriedly, and one of them, Carlos, asked me if I was okay. I couldn't even speak. I could only shake my head while the pain dominated me. Desperate, I decided it was time to ask someone for help. So I stood up from the table, staggered as if I were in a horror movie, and barely managed to walk to the exit before collapsing on the floor. I remember the last image I saw before losing consciousness. Carlos's frightened face, screaming for help and crying. When I came to, I was in the hospital section of the hospital, with bright lights above me and a strange smell of disinfectant that filled my lungs. I felt groggy, as if I had rolled around in a laundry room all night. A nurse was next to me, explaining that I had an attack of appendicitis and would need immediate surgery. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. The idea of being in an operating room scared me. I had seen too many horror movies not to feel uncomfortable. After a couple of hours, during which I was given some medication, the pain subsided a little. I felt somewhat more awake as I was wheeled into the operating room. Although I tried to calm myself with deep breaths, I couldn't stop thinking about all those stories of people who never woke up again. It's just an appendectomy. I tried to remind myself that there was nothing alarming. But just as I was about to let go of the anesthesia, something strange happened. A cold sensation ran through my body, as if a presence was looming over me. I felt heavier, as if the air was thicker and harder to breathe. The next time I opened my eyes, I was not in the operating room. My senses were awake, but this place was alien to me. It was dark and sinister, and an overwhelming silence enveloped everything around me. Instead of being in a hospital bed, I was in a narrow corridor with gray, dead walls. A kind of mist hovered around, preventing me from seeing more than a few steps. I frowned, wondering what kind of nightmare I had gotten myself into. Slowly, I began to walk, resting my hands on the walls to steady myself. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low murmur that seemed to call my name. Jay. The voice sounded familiar, but when I turned around, no one was there, just the enveloping mist and the sinister silence that filled everything. A shiver ran through me, and fear took hold of me again. I decided to keep walking, hoping to find a way out or someone who could help me. But the further I walked, the more trapped I felt. The walls seemed to close in, and the air became even denser and more oppressive. Every time I turned a corner, I felt a dark presence behind me, as if something was lurking, perhaps beasts or mad spirits. At that moment, I thought about the anesthesia and the possibility that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I was confused and overwhelmed. Nothing was clear to me. Finally, I came to a half-open door at the end of the hall. It looked different, old, made of wood, adorned with carvings I didn't understand and had never seen before. Without thinking, I pushed the door open, and what I saw on the other side made my heart skip a beat. It was an operating room. On the table lay a body covered with a blue sheet. I couldn't quite make it out, but the feeling that it was myself drove me crazy. As I got closer, I heard the murmur of laughter again. Distant noises, familiar voices of my friends, as if they were calling me from the background. I could tell that I was trapped between two worlds, and all I wanted was to get out of here. But just as I was about to enter the door, it slammed shut behind me. I turned around and saw a group of white figures walking toward me, wearing surgical gowns. They couldn't be the doctors. I knew something was definitely wrong. At that moment, I screamed loudly, and that scream echoed down the hall like an endless echo. Suddenly, everything began to fade. The laughter died down, and the mist began to dissipate. As the echo of that scream bounced back into the room, the disappearance of that oppressive place was a real relief, and as the mist vanished, peace returned to me. Suddenly I heard distant beeping, loud and constant, a beeping that repeated rhythmically. When I came to, I was in a hospital room, but this time everything was different. There was no mist or the oppressive silence anymore. And a nurse was in front of me, looking at me worriedly. I was safe, but the experience left me with a lump in my throat. After all, the surgery went well, and although I survived, the vision of that other world remains engraved in my memory to this day. I still wonder if a part of me is still trapped in the shadows while the rest of me moves on. Sometimes I return to that dark corridor in dreams, and the fear never completely fades. This experience became a strange part of my history, and it was so vivid that I remember it as if it were any other earthly event in my life.